The storm came down from the mountains like an angry beast, and Daniel Harper sat alone in his cabin, listening to the thunder shake the walls around him. He had built this place with his own hands 3 years ago, deep in the Rocky Mountains, where no one would bother him, and where he could forget the things he had seen during his years in the United Earth Defense Corps. The year was 2847, and humanity had joined the Galactic Confederation half a century ago. But Daniel wanted nothing to do with aliens or space stations, or the memories that haunted his dreams every single night. He was 34 years old and felt like he was 80, worn down by guilt and grief, and the faces of people he could not save. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled outside. And Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee, while the rain hammered against the windows like fists demanding entry. Had just settled into his chair when he heard it, a scratching sound at the front door. Soft at first, but growing more desperate with each passing second. Daniel frowned and set down his cup. Wondering what kind of animal would be out in weather like this, he grabbed his flashlight and walked to the door. And when he pulled it open, the wind nearly knocked him backward. But it was not the wind that made him freeze in place. It was the creature lying on his doorstep, shivering and bleeding and looking up at him with eyes like molten gold. The creature was about the size of a large dog, covered in iridescent purple scales that shimmered even in the dim light of the storm. It had wings folded tight against its body, and a long tail curled around its legs. And there was a deep wound on its side that leaked dark blood onto the wooden porch. Daniel knew what this creature was, and the knowledge sent ice running through his veins during his classified missions with the Defense Corps. He had received briefings about the Draconians, an ancient alien species that resembled the dragons from Earth mythology. They were considered one of the most powerful and dangerous species in the known galaxy, capable of breathing plasma fire hot enough to melt through starship hulls. They were also incredibly rare, almost extinct, and they never allowed themselves to be seen by other species unless they wanted to be seen. So what was a Draconian hatchling doing on his doorstep in the middle of a Colorado thunderstorm? The creature made a small sound, something between a whimper and a chirp, and its golden eyes seemed to plead with Daniel for help. He should call the authorities. He knew that much without question. The Galactic Confederation had strict laws about Draconians, and unauthorized contact with one could result in imprisonment or worse. But the hatchling was hurt and scared and alone. And Daniel had spent too many years watching people die to walk away from something that needed his help against every rational thought in his head. He bent down and carefully lifted the creature into his arms. It was surprisingly light, and it pressed against his chest like a frightened child seeking comfort from a parent. Daniel carried it inside and kicked the door shut behind him, and the warmth of the cabin seemed to calm the hatchling immediately. Laid it down on a blanket near the fire and examined the wound on its side. And his combat medic training kicked in like it had never left. The injury was deep but clean, probably caused by a sharp rock or a piece of metal, and it would need stitches and antibiotics to heal properly. Daniel gathered his medical supplies and got to work, talking softly to the creature the whole time, even though he doubted it could understand him. The hatchling watched him with those incredible golden eyes, never flinching, even when he cleaned the wound with antiseptic solution. When he finished stitching the injury and applying a bandage, the creature let out a long sigh and closed its eyes, finally allowing itself to rest. Daniel sat back on his heels and stared at the sleeping hatchling, wondering what in the galaxy he had just gotten himself into. Over the next few hours, the storm passed and the hatchling slept. And Daniel did research on his old military database terminal that he had never bothered to disconnect. What he found made his blood run cold with understanding. Draconians bonded with a single individual for their entire lives, and unbonded hatchlings almost never survived past their first year. The bond was not random. It was chosen by the hatchling's parent before death. Based on observing potential guardians and judging their worthiness, Daniel thought back to a mission 3 years ago. A classified rescue operation on a collapsing space station where he had saved 17 alien children from certain death. He had not hesitated for even 1 second, throwing himself into danger again and again to carry those kids to safety while the station fell apart around him. Someone had been watching him that day, a dying Dracorian mother who saw a human risk everything to save children that were not his own. She had chosen him for her offspring, and now that offspring had found its way to his door. The hatchling stirred and opened its eyes, looking directly at Daniel with an intelligence that seemed far beyond its small size. Something passed between them in that moment, a warmth that spread through Daniel's chest and settled into his bones like it had always belonged there. He could feel the creature's emotions, exhaustion, and relief, and something that felt remarkably like hope. The bond was forming whether he wanted it or not, connecting him to this small purple dragon that had traveled across the stars to find him. Daniel reached out slowly and placed his hand on the hatchling's head, and the creature closed its eyes and pressed into his touch. He did not know what to call it yet, but watching the firelight dance across those shimmering scales gave him an idea. Ember. He would call the hatchling Ember. The creature seemed to approve, because it made a soft sound of contentment and curled tighter into its blanket. Daniel knew he should report this to the Confederation, knew that keeping an unauthorized Dracorian bond secret was a serious crime, but as he looked at Ember sleeping peacefully by his fire, he knew he could not betray this creature that had chosen him above all others in the galaxy, had failed to save so many people during his years of service, had watched friends die in his arms and carried their faces in his nightmares ever since. But this hatchling was alive and needed him, and Daniel Harper was not going to let another innocent creature die on his watch. He pulled a blanket over his own shoulders and settled into the chair beside the fire, keeping watch over his unexpected guest. Outside the cabin, the storm had passed and the stars were coming out. And somewhere in those stars were people who would want to take Ember away. Daniel made a silent promise to himself and to the sleeping hatchling at his feet. They would have to go through him first, and he was done running from fights that mattered for the first time in 3 years. Daniel Harper had something worth protecting, and that changed everything. 3 weeks passed, and Ember grew stronger with each day. The wound on the hatchling's side healing into a faint silver scar that would eventually fade completely. Daniel was amazed by how fast the creature developed. When it first arrived, Ember was the size of a large dog, but now the hatchling had grown to the size of a small pony and showed no signs of slowing down. Purple scales had deepened in color and seemed to glow faintly in the dark, and Ember's wings were strong enough now to carry the hatchling on short flights around the cabin. Their bond grew deeper every day, and Daniel found himself experiencing flashes of Ember's emotions without warning. He would be chopping wood and suddenly feel a surge of curiosity, or he would be cooking dinner and sense a wave of contentment washing over him from the creature resting by the fire. The connection went both ways. Ember seemed to know when Daniel was having a bad day and would press against him with a soft rumbling sound that felt like comfort, made physical for the first time in years. Daniel was sleeping through the night without nightmares, and he realized that caring for this creature had given him something he thought he had lost forever: purpose. But their peaceful existence could not last, and Daniel knew that trouble was coming long before it actually arrived. One morning he woke to find Ember standing rigid at the window, golden eyes fixed on something in the distance that Daniel could not see. Through their bond, he felt the hatchling's unease, a prickling sensation of being watched by unfriendly eyes. Daniel grabbed his binoculars and scanned the tree line, but he saw nothing except the usual forest animals going about their business still. He trusted Ember's instincts more than his own eyes, and he spent the rest of the day checking the security measures around his property. 3 days later, his caution was proven justified when a woman appeared at the edge of his land carrying scientific equipment and wearing the uniform of Earth's Xenofauna Research Division. Her name was Laura Mitchell, and she was a wildlife biologist specializing in alien species that had made their way to Earth. She was in her early 30s with sharp brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who would spend years working in remote locations. Daniel watched her approach from his window while Ember hid in the back room, and he felt the hatchling's fear through their bond like a cold hand gripping his heart. He stepped out onto the porch before Laura could get any closer. Blocking her path with his body and his expression, Laura stopped and held up her hands to show she meant no harm, explaining that she was investigating unusual energy readings in this area. Sensors had been picking up signatures that matched no known Earth species, and she was required to investigate any potential alien wildlife presence in protected wilderness areas. Daniel kept his face neutral and told her there was nothing unusual on his property, just a man who wanted to be left alone with his thoughts and his regrets. Laura studied him for a long moment with those sharp eyes, and Daniel could tell she did not believe him for even 1 second, but she nodded politely and said she would continue her survey elsewhere. Turning to walk back toward the tree line without pushing the issue further, Daniel watched her go and felt relief flooding through him. But the feeling was short-lived, because Ember chose that exact moment to emerge from the cabin. The hatchling had grown too large to fit through the door easily and knocked over a stack of firewood with a tremendous crash that echoed across the clearing. Laura spun around and her eyes went wide as she saw Ember standing beside Daniel, purple scales gleaming in the morning sunlight and golden eyes fixed on her with wary intelligence. For several heartbeats, nobody moved, and Daniel could feel his future crumbling around him like that space station had crumbled 3 years ago. Then Laura did something unexpected. She lowered her scanner and let out a long breath, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with wonder rather than accusation. She said she had never seen a living Dracorian before, had only read about them in classified files, that she was not supposed to have access to. Daniel stepped between Laura and Ember, his body tense and ready for a fight. But Laura shook her head and told him she was not there to take the hatchling away. She had come because she intercepted a transmission 2 days ago, a coded message from a criminal organization called the Vexer Syndicate. They had detected the same energy signatures that led her here, and they were sending a team of hunters to capture whatever was producing those readings. Laura explained that the Vexer Syndicate dealt in rare alien specimens, selling them to collectors and research facilities that did not ask questions about where they came from. A living Dracorian hatchling would be worth more credits than most planets could earn in a decade, and the Syndicate would kill anyone who stood between them and their prize. Daniel felt Ember press against his side, and through their bond he sensed the hatchling's determination to stand and fight. Beside its guardian, he asked Laura why she was warning them instead of reporting this to the Confederation authorities, and her expression darkened with old pain. She told him that her brother had been killed by the Syndicate 5 years ago during a mission to rescue captured specimens from one of their facilities. The authorities had done nothing because the Syndicate had connections in high places, and Laura had been hunting them ever since with no luck. This was her chance to finally bring them down while also protecting a creature that deserved to live free from exploitation. Daniel looked at Ember and then back at Laura, and he made his decision in the space of a single breath. He told Laura that he was not going to run. That running meant living in fear forever, and he was done being afraid. Laura smiled grimly and said she was hoping he would say that, because she had no intention of running either. They had maybe 2 days before the Syndicate hunters arrived. And that was not much time to prepare a defense, but Daniel had survived impossible odds before. And now he had something he did not have during those dark missions in space. He had Ember. And he had someone willing to fight beside him. And that made all the difference in the galaxy. The hatchling spread its wings and let out a sound that was almost like a roar. Small but fierce and full of promise, Laura watched with amazement as Ember launched into the air and circled the cabin. Once before landing gracefully beside Daniel, she said she had never seen anything so beautiful in her entire life. And Daniel had to agree with her completely. The storm was coming, but this time Daniel would not face it alone. The Vexor Syndicate did not believe in second chances or fair fights. And the team they sent to capture Ember was proof of their ruthless. Efficiency 6 elite hunters led by a reptilian alien named Krovax descended on the Rocky Mountains with one mission: capture the Dracorian alive and eliminate any witnesses who might cause problems. Latter Krovax was a Sethrani, a species known for their cold blood and even colder hearts. And he had been hunting rare specimens for the Syndicate for over 20 years. His scales were dark green, and his eyes were yellow with vertical slits. And he moved through the forest like a shadow that had learned to kill. Daniel and Laura had spent the past 2 days preparing for exactly this kind of assault. And they were as ready as two humans could ever be. Daniel revealed his true background to Laura during their preparations, explaining that he was not just a simple combat medic who had retired to the mountains. He had been attached to special operations units during his service with the Defense Corps, and he had skills that went far beyond treating wounds and setting broken bones. Laura was impressed, but not surprised. She had suspected there was more to Daniel than he let on from the moment she first saw the way he moved and assessed his surroundings. Together they fortified the cabin and set up early warning systems using Laura's scientific equipment, rigging sensors along every approach that might give away the hunters' positions. Daniel dug into his storage shed and pulled out weapons he had hoped he would never need again, along with traps and devices he had designed during his military days. Ember stayed close throughout the preparations, the hatchling understanding the danger through their bond and refusing to leave Daniel's side for more than a few minutes at a time. The hunters arrived at nightfall, slipping through the forest like ghosts made of malice and greed. Laura's sensors picked them up half a mile out, giving Daniel and Ember enough time to take their positions and prepare for the coming battle. Daniel felt calm in a way he had not experienced since his last mission, his training taking over and pushing his emotions into a small box where they could not interfere with what needed to be done. The first hunter triggered one of Daniel's traps and went down with a cry of pain and surprise. A net weighted with stones pinning him to the ground. 2 more fell into concealed pits that Daniel had spent an entire day digging. And Laura took out a 4th with a well-aimed shot from her stun rifle that dropped him before he could raise his weapon. That left 2 hunters and Krovax himself. And Daniel knew the easy part was over. Krovax was not like his subordinates. He had survived decades in this business by being smarter and more dangerous than anyone who came after him. Circled around the cabin while his remaining hunters provided a distraction. And Daniel only realized the trap when he heard Laura cry out in alarm. The Sethrani had gotten behind them somehow, moving through the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for a creature his size. Daniel spun around to find Krovax holding Laura by the throat, a plasma pistol pressed against her temple, and a cold smile on his reptilian face. The alien told Daniel to surrender the Dracorian or watch his friend die, and his yellow eyes showed no doubt that he would follow through on the threat. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities and discarded them just as quickly. Finding no option that did not end with Laura's death, he started to lower his weapon, buying time while desperately searching for any way out of this impossible situation. But Ember had other ideas. And Daniel felt a surge of fierce, protective rage through their bond that was not his own. Hatchling launched from the shadows with a scream that split the night air. Wings spread wide and golden eyes blazing with Krovax turned to face the threat. His plasma pistol swinging away from Lara for just one crucial second. That was all the time Lara needed. She drove her elbow into the Sethrani's midsection and twisted free from his grip. Dropping to the ground and rolling away, Krovax recovered quickly and aimed his weapon at Ember. But the hatchling did something that should have been impossible for a Dracorian so young. Ember opened that small mouth and released a blast of superheated plasma that lit up the night like a second sun. The flame did not hit Krovax directly, but it forced him to dive for cover and gave Daniel the opening he needed to tackle the remaining two hunters who had frozen in shock. The fight was brutal and fast. And when it was over, both hunters were unconscious on the ground, with Daniel standing above them breathing hard, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Ember had collapsed after releasing that flame. The effort drained every ounce of energy from the hatchling's small body. Daniel ran to Ember's side and gathered the creature in his arms, feeling through their bond how weak and exhausted the hatchling had become. Laura knelt beside them with concern written across her face, checking Ember's vital signs with her scanner and shaking her head in disbelief. She said that juvenile Dracorians should not be able to produce flame at all, that this ability typically did not develop until they were fully mature adults. The bond between Daniel and Ember must be accelerating the hatchling's development in ways that had never been documented. Before, Daniel did not care about the science. He only cared that Ember was alive and breathing. Even if those breaths were shallow and weak, he looked up and scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of Krovax. But the Sethrani had vanished into the darkness, like he had never been there at all. Laura found tracks leading away from the cabin, and she told Daniel that Krovax had retreated, but would definitely be back. The Syndicate did not give up on targets this valuable, and Krovax had his reputation to consider after losing to a human and a juvenile. Dragon Daniel carried Ember back to the cabin and laid the hatchling by the fire. Watching those purple scales rise and fall with each tired breath, Laura secured the unconscious hunters with restraints and began treating their injuries, because even enemies deserve basic medical care in Daniel's opinion. He sat beside Ember through the long night, keeping watch and feeling the hatchling's strength slowly return through their bond. When dawn finally came, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had won this battle. But the war was just beginning. Krovax would return with more hunters and more weapons. And next time they might not be so lucky. Daniel needed help. Real help from people he could trust with his life and with Ember's life. He pulled out his old military communicator and started composing messages to people he had not spoken to in years. It was time to call in some favors from the soldiers who still owed him their lives. Ember recovered slowly over the next 2 days, and Daniel barely left the hatchling's side except to eat and check the perimeter. Laura monitored the Syndicate's communications using equipment she had hidden in her vehicle. And what she learned made Daniel's blood run cold with dread. Krovax had contacted his superiors and reported the failed capture attempt. And the Syndicate's response was swift and overwhelming. They were sending 30 mercenaries with heavy weapons and a gunship for air support. Enough firepower to level the entire mountain if necessary. The Dracorian was too valuable to abandon. And the Syndicate's reputation demanded that they crush anyone who dared resist them. Daniel knew he could not fight an army alone, not even with Laura's help and Ember's developing powers. He needed backup from people who had faced impossible odds before and survived. People who owed him their lives and would answer his call without hesitation. The messages went out across secure military channels to 4 people who had served with Daniel in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The first to arrive was Kevin Marsh. Daniel's former commanding officer who had retired after their last mission together went so terribly wrong. Kevin was in his late 40s with gray hair and a scarred face that told stories he never needed to put into words. He landed his small transport in the clearing behind the cabin and walked up to Daniel with a firm handshake and a simple question, "What do you need?" Daniel introduced him to Ember, and Kevin studied the Dracorian with the careful assessment of a soldier evaluating an asset. Said he had seen many strange things during his years of service, but a human bonded to a dragon was definitely a first. Tammy Santos arrived next, a pilot who could fly anything with an engine and several things that probably should not have been able to fly at. All she was small and quick with dark curly hair and a smile that made people underestimate her until they saw her in the cockpit of a combat craft. Amy had brought her own ship, a modified freighter with weapons that were definitely not standard civilian issue. Nathan Cole came thundering in on a hoverbike loaded with enough explosives to start a small war. His dark sense of humor already making jokes about the situation. He was the team's demolitions expert, a large man with gentle eyes that seemed wrong on someone who made his living blowing things up. Nathan took one look at Ember and declared that the dragon was much prettier than Daniel deserved, which made Lavra laugh. For the first time since the attack, the last to arrive was Lisa Tran, a communications specialist who could hack into any system ever built by human or alien hands. She was quiet and intense with sharp features and fingers that never stopped moving across her portable terminals. Lisa immediately set up a command post in Daniel's living room, tapping into satellites and monitoring every frequency the syndicate might use. Kevin called them all together and asked Daniel to explain exactly what they were dealing with. And Daniel told them everything from the beginning. He told them about the storm and the wounded hatchling at his door, about the bond that formed between them and the mother who had chosen him. Years ago, he told them about the syndicate hunters and the battle in the forest, about Ember's impossible flame and Krovax's promise to return with reinforcements when he finished. Kevin asked the question that Daniel had been dreading. Why did you not report this to the Confederation when it first happened? Daniel looked at Ember sleeping by the fire and answered honestly, saying that the hatchling had chosen him when no one else had chosen him for anything good in a long time. He had failed so many people during his years of service, had watched friends die and carried their names like weights on his soul, but Ember needed him and trusted him, and he could not betray that trust, even if keeping it meant breaking the law. The room was silent for a moment, and then Amy stepped forward and put her hand on Daniel's shoulder. She reminded him that he had saved her life on Theta Station when the hull breached and everyone else ran for the escape pods. Daniel had stayed behind and pulled her from the wreckage, carrying her half a mile through vacuum-exposed corridors to safety. Nathan said Daniel had done the same for him on a mission in the Outer Rim, digging him out of a collapsed bunker while enemy fire rained down around them. Kevin and Lisa nodded in agreement, both of them carrying similar memories of times when Daniel had risked everything to save their lives. They were here because Daniel had never abandoned them, and they were not going to abandon him now. Next 2 days were a blur of preparation and planning as the team fortified the mountain for the coming assault. Nathan rigged the surrounding forest with traps and explosives, creating a maze of death for any enemy foolish enough to approach on foot. Amy hid her ship in a canyon 2 miles away, ready for emergency extraction if everything went wrong. Lisa tapped into syndicate communications and fed their plans to Kevin, who adjusted the defense strategy based on every new piece of information. Laura worked alongside them all, her scientific knowledge proving useful in ways that surprised even her. Daniel trained with Ember, strengthening their bond and practicing the coordination that would make them effective in combat. The hatchling was growing stronger every day, and Daniel could feel Ember's eagerness to fight beside him through their connection on the night before the expected attack. Daniel sat outside with Ember, under a sky full of stars that suddenly seemed very far away. He opened his mind to the hatchling and shared his memories, his childhood in a small town, his parents who had died before he joined the military, the happiest moments of his life, and the darkest hours of his service. Ember responded by sharing images of warmth and safety, of a mother's love that had lasted even beyond death. Daniel saw the Dracorian mother watching him from the shadows of that collapsing station, saw the decision being made in those golden eyes, so like Ember's own. He felt the mother's certainty that this human was worthy, that he would protect her child when she could not. Tears ran down Daniel's face as he made a silent promise to that ghost watching from beyond the stars. No matter what happened tomorrow, Ember would survive, even if Daniel had to give everything he had to make it happen. The hatchling pressed against him with a rumbling sound of comfort and love, and Daniel wrapped his arms around those purple scales. They stayed that way until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and the sound of approaching engines echoed through the mountain valleys. The syndicate had arrived, and the final battle was about to begin. The syndicate forces came from 3 directions at once, 30 mercenaries spreading through the forest like a disease, intent on consuming everything in its path. Kevin coordinated the defense from the cabin's command post, while Lisa tracked enemy movements on her screens and fed targeting data to the others. Nathan S-traps began claiming victims within the first 5 minutes, explosions echoing through the valleys and thinning the enemy ranks before they could reach the clearing. Amy roared overhead in her modified freighter, strafing enemy positions with precision fire that sent mercenaries diving for cover in every direction. Daniel fought at the center of the battle with Ember at his side, the bond between them making them move like a single warrior with 2 bodies. He knew where the hatchling would be before Ember moved, and Ember sensed threats to Daniel before they could become dangerous. The dragon had recovered fully from the exhaustion of that first flame, and now Ember used fire sparingly, but with devastating effect. Mercenaries who got too close found themselves facing plasma hot enough to melt through body armor, and those who survived quickly learned to keep their distance. But the syndicate had not sent an army without planning for resistance, and Krovax had studied his opponents carefully since their last encounter. The gunship appeared over the ridge like a metal predator, its weapon systems humming with enough power to level the entire mountain. Laura screamed a warning just before the first missile struck, and the cabin exploded in a shower of wood and stone that sent everyone scrambling for cover. Kevin dragged Lisa out of the wreckage while Nathan provided covering fire from behind a boulder that was rapidly being chipped away by enemy rounds. Amy tried to engage the gunship, but her freighter was outmatched by the military-grade craft, and she was forced to retreat before she was blown out of the sky. Daniel found himself separated from the others, pinned down behind a fallen tree with Ember pressed against his side. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Krovax approaching, the Zithrani walking calmly through the battlefield like he was taking a stroll through a garden, and he was not alone. Laura was in his grip again, a plasma blade pressed against her throat, and those yellow eyes gleaming with triumph. Krovax called out to Daniel, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of battle, and offered the same deal he had made before surrender. The Dracorian and the woman lives. Resist and everyone dies, including the precious hatchling that had caused so much trouble. Daniel rose from cover with his hands raised, his weapon discarded on the ground, and his expression carefully blank. Krovax smiled that cold reptilian smile and gestured for his remaining mercenaries to secure the human while he kept Laura as insurance. But as Daniel walked forward, he was not surrendering. He was buying time and getting closer to the enemy, who threatened everything he loved. When Krovax was within arm's reach, Daniel attacked with all the speed and skill his military training had given him, struck the plasma blade away from Laura's throat and shoved her aside. Putting himself between her and the Sethranges for a Krovax was faster than Daniel expected and stronger than any human. And his claws raked across Daniel's shoulder, leaving deep wounds that immediately began to bleed. Daniel kept fighting even as the pain threatened to overwhelm him. Landing blows that would have killed a human but only angered the alien hunter Krovax knocked him to the ground and raised his claws for a killing strike. And Daniel closed his eyes and thought of Ember one last time, but the killing blow never came. Because Ember had been watching through their bond and feeling Daniel's pain, like it was the hatchling's own. Something changed in that moment. Something that should have taken years triggered in the space of a single heartbeat. The bond between human and Dracorian reached full maturity in a surge of desperate love and fierce protection. And Ember began to transform. The hatchling grew larger with each passing second. Purple scales hardening into armor and wings, expanding until they blocked out the sun. When the transformation was complete, Ember was no longer a juvenile but a full adult Dracorian. 40 feet of magnificent fury with flames ready to burn. Krovax barely had time to register what was happening before Ember's fire reduced the gunship to molten slag falling. From the sky, the remaining mercenaries threw down their weapons and ran. But there was nowhere to hide from a dragon that had just come into its full power. Ember cornered Krovax against a cliff face, those golden eyes burning with rage and that massive mouth opening to release killing flame. But through their bond, Daniel sent a wave of calm and conviction. A message that needed no words to be understood. They were not going to kill Krovax. They were not going to become the monsters the Syndicate expected them to be. Mercy was not weakness. It was the choice that separated protectors from predators. And Daniel refused to let vengeance poison what they had built together. Ember hesitated, the rage still burning bright. But the bond carried Daniel's certainty and his belief that this was the right path. The great dragon lowered its head and stepped back, allowing Kevin and Nathan to secure the terrified Sethrani with restraints. The battle was over, and somehow against all odds they had won without losing their souls in the process. The aftermath was complicated, as Daniel had known it would be from the moment he decided to keep Ember's existence secret. Confederation representatives arrived 2 days later, prepared to separate human and Dracorian and enforce the laws that Daniel had broken. But they found themselves facing not just one human and one dragon, but a group of decorated veterans who had decided that this was a hill worth dying on. And they found themselves facing an adult Dracorian whose power shook the mountain when Ember made it clear that separation was not an option. The officials were intelligent enough to recognize a fight they could not win, and wise enough to find a diplomatic solution. Instead, Daniel was granted official guardian status, the first human ever authorized to bond with a Dracorian under Confederation law leases. Evidence against the Syndicate led to arrests across 3 sectors, and Krovax would spend the rest of his very long life in a maximum security prison. Laura was offered a position leading a new research initiative on human-Dracorian relations, which she accepted with a smile. Months passed and life settled into something resembling normal. Though normal had taken on an entirely new meaning for Daniel Harper, his cabin was rebuilt larger than before, with modifications to accommodate a dragon who refused to sleep anywhere except beside his guardian. The old unit visited often, and Laura came by almost every week to check on Ember's development and share meals with Daniel. The Vaya nightmares that had haunted Daniel for years were finally gone, replaced by dreams of flying through mountain skies with Ember beneath him. One evening, Daniel sat on his porch watching his dragon soar through the sunset, those purple scales catching the light like living jewels. Broken soldier who had hidden himself away from the galaxy had become something new. A guardian, a legend, a man who had found his purpose. Ember landed beside him with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature so large, and those golden eyes held nothing but love and contentment. Daniel reached out and placed his hand on his dragon's snout. Feeling the warmth of their bond pulsing through every fiber of his being, he was no longer alone, no longer running, no longer haunted by the ghosts of people he could not save. He was home. And he had Ember, and that was more than enough for one human lifetime. Above them, the stars were coming out. The same stars where Daniel had once fought and suffered, and lost so much, but now when he looked at them, he did not see battlefields and graveyards. He saw possibilities and adventures waiting to happen, and beside him Ember rumbled with agreement, because their story was not ending here, was only just beginning.